How will humanity die out? It's a common question that a lot of people have. Will it be because of a giant meteor that crashes into the Earth and wipes us all out, similar to the dinosaurs? Will it be because of omnicide? Will humanity wipe itself out with nuclear weaponry? Will humanity destroy itself with the help of hyper-intelligent AI hell-bent on destroying its creator? We can't really know how it'll happen or even when, but it is an inevitability, and my personal theory is that disease and plague will play a big role in wiping humanity off the face of the earth. To give you some perspective on what I mean, World War II is known as the deadliest war in human history, with a casualty count of 80 million people, which is a lot, but when compared to the Black Plague, my point becomes clear. Throughout history, disease has proven itself to be an extremely effective way of culling our population, and there were many times in our history where disease almost finished the job. Welcome to Curiosity Corner. The boat is arguably one of humanity's greatest inventions. It enabled us not only to explore the world we inhabit and discover new lands, but it also allowed us to trade crucial resources with one another as well. Things like grain, sugar, and oil have been a staple in trade since time immemorial, and thanks to these massive ships, humanity has excelled in getting these resources to whoever's got the scratch to pay for it. However, this has always had some unforeseen consequences. Because these boats carried so much grain, the smell was a big attraction for the black rat, as it's the rodent's preferred cuisine. To make matters even worse, the rats were covered in fleas that carried the deadly disease that would later be known as the Black Plague. This particular ship is going to Constantinople of the Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Justinian I at the time, who was about to get hit with the first major pandemic in recorded history. During its travels, the fleas had full reign to bite crewmates with fangs so small they probably never even noticed their own doom. Meanwhile, down below, the rats were gorging themselves on the grain while tainting it in the process with their feces and fleas, and likely reproducing in it as well. When the boat finally arrived at the shore, it might as well have been a giant ticking plague bomb. As the carts of grain were being unloaded, so were the various infected rats who were now free to roam the city streets, infecting everyone and everything they came into contact with. The same goes for the poor sailors who unknowingly doomed their entire city. As the sailors rushed home to either their families or the bottle, all of their stories share the same ending. They wake up one morning in their sweat-soaked beds with an intense fever. Their body starts to swell all throughout, and if they're lucky, that's where it ends, and they either meet with a merciful death or they recover just fine. For others, it didn't quite end there. Horrible nightmares, delusions, and excruciating pain for days before finally succumbing to the illness were very common occurrences. The biggest factor in the plague's spread was just an inability to fully understand what was even happening. Most people didn't even realize they were sick until it was too late, and medicine at the time was rather primitive compared to what we have now. On top of that, the Byzantine Empire was constantly at war for control of Italy. Emperor Justinian was quite busy fighting Vandals and Berbers for North Africa, as well as constantly defending the empire against Franks, Slavs, Avars, and barbarians. This meant that food supply trains were making trips all throughout to support the war effort. And remember, wherever you find food and grain, you also find rats and fleas. If you were unfortunate enough to catch the plague, there was only really two options for you. If you were wealthy, you had physicians at your disposal that could treat you and increase your chances of survival, though it was never guaranteed. Those less well-off turned to home remedies, cold baths, powders blessed by saints, magical rings, and copious amounts of drugs. And who knows, maybe those remedies worked for these people. It's not like the plague had a 100% mortality rate. There were plenty of people who caught it and survived. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague, but was fortunate or rich enough that he actually survived his encounter. Others were not so lucky. The Plague of Justinian, as it would later be referred to as, swept through most of Europe and Asia, leaving pure devastation and tragedy in its wake. It's estimated to have killed about 20 to 50 million people during this time, which at this point in history, was nearly half of the world's estimated global population. It got so bad that at a certain point, nobody really knew what to do with the bodies. They littered the streets of the capital city. Once tombs and graveyards were filled to the brim, soldiers resorted to digging trenches. They also had to resort to dumping bodies into the sea, and boats were filled with casualties of the plague. Historians guess that the only reason this particular instance of plague ended was because there was no one else around to get sick. Large towns and cities were leveled by the plague, and people became so spread out that the disease didn't really have the distance to do any more severe damage. The Byzantine Empire was severely crippled by the plague in more ways than one. Trade throughout the empire stopped almost completely because less farmers meant less grains and crops, which caused these goods to become extremely rare and therefore expensive. Additionally, barbarian forces were beginning to weaken the empire's forces as they were less healthy soldiers than before. But Justinian I didn't worry himself about these issues. Despite the economic ruin his empire was in, he continued to wage war and build vanity projects in the capital city, which really says a lot about the human condition. The Justinian Plague is one of the first recorded instances of a major pandemic, and it's one of the deadliest in human history. And to be honest, the bubonic plague was a pretty big nuisance in our early history. It never really went away, just stayed dormant and waiting for the right conditions to run amok once more. And some 800 years later, Europe would experience quite the awakening. But that is for next time.